Hello and welcome. My name is Dr. Tim Stjanovic of the University of St Andrews School of Geography and Sustainable Development. I'm a social scientist by background with a special interest in a particular realm of the planet, our oceans and coasts, and most particularly our human interactions with them. For a while now, I've been discussing with Dr. Oliver Searle, composer at the Royal Conservatoire of Scotland, how we might create a piece of music that reflects the special characteristics of the coast. During this process, our colleague, Dr. Richard Bates, became involved, and he pointed out to us a particular place in St Andrews, below the Scores Cliffs, a sea cave. And along with Alex South, professional musician, clarinetist, we set about creating a piece of music together that reflects the special characteristics of this place. We hope you enjoy it.
I mean, something that strikes me is that although ideas and abstract ideas are unrelated to musical concerns can inspire and inform choices that are made during the making of a piece, or uh, I was going to say maybe in an improvisation, but I think it's really hard if you're in the moment of doing something, you're not consciously like thinking, oh, I must respond to the idea of human interaction here, or
Right.
human interaction with the coast, or I've got to somehow have in front of my in my oral imagination some sort of um, awareness of coastal erosion. I mean that
Hmm.
just doesn't really musical doesn't play a musical role. Afterwards you could think, or beforehand you could think, okay, erosion. What could that mean for
Yes.
the musical process? Maybe it could mean
Okay.
um, a, a particular kind of shaping of a phrase, or
Okay.
a shaping to kinds of sounds that are being made. But I think
So,
when you're actually doing it,
okay. It's almost like you can't do jazz and statistically analyze a questionnaire survey at the same time.
I think that's
You,
exactly
they,
what I'm trying to
they
say.
can't quite be coterminous,
Yeah,
but
exactly.
yeah.
So
But
I mean,
that doesn't mean they might not inform one another in a way.
yeah, and I
Yeah.
also think that, and Ollie will probably have more to say about this than me in
Right.
terms of this particular piece as the composer. But when a piece comes to have a shape, it then sort of uh, it has a life of its own in a way.
Right.
Once things start coming together in what you're making, um, uh, it has a life of its own, which then can kind of frees itself from whatever
Okay.
initial thoughts you had about the beginnings of that process. And
Almost like it's perpetuating in some kind of way, or
yeah, or it sort of generates its own telos. It's
right.
its form which it's going to take becomes clear as the process goes. And if you're making something with a particular function, if you're making music to a film and you knew you had to, you know, fit a character, a mood or a character, or aim towards a particular time point when something had to happen, then that's
Yeah.
different. You have that in mind. And I suppose there are always some kind of composerly restraints, about the length of a piece, or I mean, in this case, the material that's to hand.
Hmm.
But nonetheless, I feel that certainly in the pieces I've been involved in making and shaping, that there's, when when once you start working on the material, at some point it does sort of take over, and then your job is to let that flower, and you make a certain number of choices at the beginning, and that really kind of sets some sort of tone for what comes afterwards.
Yeah. I mean, that's really helpful to understand because, I mean, coming at it as someone who isn't a trained musician, then I've got more to understand about the difference between, my cartoon characterization, understanding of what it means for you to compose or perform something, and what it's really like. So that's really interesting. That's really helpful to understand. I think I can get that. I could get that.
Yeah, I don't know if Ollie agrees about that. Or, I mean,
Yeah, I suppose that's the interesting thing, isn't it? Because I wonder if there's something in there about we're constantly, I suppose, artists are constantly sort of pursuing this idea of something that's site specific in a way, or something that has some, you create work, or so it's a big thing, isn't it, to have sort of be commissioned to work on something that exists and has some sort of relationship to the space in which you're performing it or creating, or whatever. And I guess that there are, yeah, in that there are certain things, I guess, that we've done that have allowed that to happen. And I guess that could be Alex simply being in that space and interacting with it in some way. And for me, that's a huge thing, actually, isn't it? But I don't know. I mean, I think it was Richard who'd asked, maybe it was Richard or Tim, but asked about the sort of the buzzing sound in or the sea sound, actually, in that soundtrack. And the thing is, actually, that's taken from Richard's drone. That's Richard's drone. And I thought, oh, that's quite cool, actually, the way it fuzzes in and out. And when, actually sound. And I think for me, that's a really interesting part of it, because that's about sort of the representation of some kind of human interaction on that natural environment, but actually becomes almost a part of the natural environment again. So there's things like that, and I put in there. And then I think that when Richard explained to me, I was kind of blown away. I was like, "What is that black line?" And that's coal. And actually, that seems perfectly obvious when you said that, but actually, when I hadn't actually that would have been my obvious kind of conclusion to reach.
The other point about the drone, I think, in reflection, is that as we are in COVID and the skies got quiet, we all got very, very, very used to suddenly, and I've noticed this in the last few weeks, being aware again of the odd plane, so it's a visual impact on our natural environment and sound of the plane. But the height of COVID, the skies were empty and we had no sound of it. And so you were in that space playing, and there was very little of human background noise, which in everyday life we've come to expect. I mean, drones, okay, are increasingly now in our spheres being used, and they will become something that we tune out, so that they're only affecting one's subconscious. And yet that it was coming in, that was the only human interference really in that environment, in that soundtrack. And yet, so it was consciously heard, but there will come a time when drones will become like subconscious. Now you may react to well, of course we're reacting to subconscious things, but there it was something that was, because it's a product of the times, and you're hearing it excessively because of the situation that we were in or are in at the moment. Anyway, that's just a different angle to take on a drone and a noise. Yeah.
Ollie, I wanted to ask you a bit more about the overall structure of the piece of music that you created, because it sort of seemed to have a beginning and a middle and end, I felt, as a listener, and some shape to it. And so I just was wanted to ask a bit more. I was going to go back and say again something I mentioned to you earlier, that I know that in a previous composition that you did called Close to Shore about sunfish, that your choice of the number of instruments and your choice about it being chamber music was affected by this idea that the sunfish swims around with a whole group of other fish. And perhaps you want to say more about that. But yeah, what was behind some of the choices you made about the structure of this piece of music?
I mean, we were chatting previously, Alex and I were talking about the fact that not really knowing, I guess, what the sort of nature of this collaboration was, or how we might use any of this material. And in a way, I'd sort of presented this. I thought, I wonder if you have a big sort of loud opening, and then in a way you could sort of allow it to sort of sit, calm down a little bit, and sort of continue quite gradually until this final gesture at the end. Because possibly we might have, I suppose, added all sorts of other elements to this. We could have talked a bit over it, or we could have shown some drone footage as part of that sort of process as well. So I was kind of thinking of the shape of that in my head. If I had this sort of 5-minute thing that happened and had room for something else to exist within it. So that could be some kind of film footage, or it could be some talking or discussion or something, or interviews or whatever. And I was sort of imagining that, thinking about having a rough idea of how that might fit together. But actually, I suppose what's come out of it is that the piece has this definite shape to it. And I was saying to Alex that a lot of the time, I've got a sort of a rough sense of the sort of pitches that Alex is playing and the shapes he's making. A lot of them actually aren't exact, because the nature of the instrument. Alex is playing by himself. He's changing the sounds as he goes, and even some that are almost the same end up being slightly different. So actually, even if you put them together, they give you quite a sort of an unusual sound world at the same time. So it ends up having these layers of things that are maybe almost the same or slightly different, but actually end up causing, having sort of an impact actually on the sort of underlying sound itself. It kind of unsettles things. And I guess that sort of big opening wash of sound that kicks off there is Alex playing sort of different versions of this one gesture in using different pitches, but in quite bold, and I guess I've allowed that to really sort of take off. If I was going to sit down, I was saying to Alex, and try and map out exactly what it was, it would be probably an impossible task. Actually, I'm not sure I could actually sort of notate it in conventional notation. So it's really sort of thinking about it as a kind of, yeah, sort of a cloud of sound, or these different sort of sonic textures that sort of shift gradually throughout the piece, if that makes any sense at all.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And then I think one of my interesting questions that I will reflect on is that, as people come to be listeners of the piece, and they know it's associated with the coast, whether that dynamism that you've given it will echo this idea that actually the coast, with its with its waves and its tides, is actually a very dynamic space. So I think there's quite a fit there, often compared to, say, walking on the land through a forest or by a mountain. We know they're dynamic on different time scales, but the coast, with its with the sea coming in there, it is really dynamic with its crashing waves and its tides, that space that we were in at low tide, which will later on be covered by water at high tide.
And I think also I agree. I mean, I think the thing that always appeals to me, I don't know if Alex wants to say more about this, or Richard too, but the sort of the chaos of a situation like that. When we turned up and Richard mentioned that there was a big rock fall there. Luckily not too recently, but that huge rock had fallen near the mouth of the cave. And actually the kind of just sort of ancient chaos of all that sort of rubble all around there. And as you said, the sort of the way that the sea comes in and is not the same every time. The weather's not the same. The situation's not the same. That really interests me. The fact that nature and sort of humans trying to create something perfectly every time kind of just can't actually happen. So I guess that's a really interesting thing for me to explore, is that how you sort of allude to that, but of course it's never going to be the same actually. So you try and highlight those differences as you come across them every time.
I really like the idea of that opening actually representing the kind of chaotic flow of water, the waves crashing in, and I'd only just thought of that as an interpretation of it. I mean, for me, it was really. I mean, it's always exciting to come and listen to this kind of to be involved in this kind of process where you record some sounds and then hand them over, and what comes back really shows the characteristic marks of the composer. Even though the composer didn't ask me to play any particular notes in this case, there were a few gentle suggestions as to the sorts of directions, the sorts of gestures, a couple of little uh, requests along the way, but nothing specific at all. And yet, what can be it seems to me a kind of sculptural process. What Ollie's working with is as you said, these kind of clouds of notes, and he very, I think, very politely describes them as being not exact or not completely replicable. And certainly when I was playing, I wasn't. Yeah, that I was trying to find some energy, find what I would, just explore the acoustic environment as much of it was of that. But something else that like really struck me when I was listening to it is that it starts off, and we talked a little bit about the sort of illusion and the impossibilities, but it starts off with several versions of me playing at once, and then it gradually pares down to maybe just two, a, a, a kind of duo, and that duo is possible in that it's my unaltered playing, untransformed electronically, and then some of the sounds then become transformed electronically as well, and so they become sort of impossible duos, and then spiraling outward to more parts at the same time. So it's very interesting as a player to come back and hear yourself in being placed into kind of dialogue with your other selves, even though there was no actual dialogue or interaction happening at the time. The skill of the composer is to put those things together so that it sounds like there might actually be some design and some interaction going on.
That's good then. So you don't feel like one of these actors who's used by a director and asked to give 30 takes just so the director can do whatever they want. You actually feel like
Oh no, I like that. Yeah.
There's a process going on whereby what you've done has been interpreted, and you find that fascinating. And
absolutely.
I think some of this, though, I mean, so we've talked about chaos and chaotic and the randomness of cliff collapse and sort of that on this dynamic shoreline. I mean, looking at it as a geologist and looking at it with the with the hand lens, if you want, of vast time to be able to think about, and these things, of course, can seem chaotic and random on a very short time period. But as we go back and we look further and further into the past, or we look broader in terms of spatial scales, then there's pattern and form to everything. And so what if you're starting with starting with a multiple of these repeated sounds coming down and then gradually paring down to maybe, as you say, maybe two of yourself, Alex, then playing it perhaps in some way is coming back to saying, well, even in the complexity of it all, there is form behind it. Now, I'm not going to go as far as saying that there is grand design in the way that is used in certain sort of views of how life works. Yet coming down to find a simplicity amongst the chaos is something that mathematically we're trying to do, to understand how the earth works, to try and take it apart, and of course that's a function of our knowledge of systems. And so perhaps in here there is a musical system of work that is being put to play consciously. I don't know, Oliver, whether it's conscious, subconscious, in how it's all, I either went from chaos to simplicity, or you reverse engineered it from the simplicity of these single things into the chaos that you started with. I mean, we look at nature and we try and understand it, and it sometimes appears too complex, too random, but it isn't random, and you can go down to say, well, Brownian motion is not random. It's got a form to how it works. And in the same way that collapse along there happened, we were there in one finite part of time, and thankfully it didn't collapse around us. But collapse is something that goes on as a function of that coastal process all the time. So, musically, finding more simple form within the complexities is something that or building complexity from simple form is perhaps mirroring the natural environment without necessarily invoking Oliver to be the man of grand design.
I'd agree with that, Richard, because isn't it true as well that we can predict the tides actually quite accurately, although there is the difference between when the tide will come on those approximate 12-hour cycles, and when it does actually come, which is subject to all these different factors like the barometric pressure at the time. Mm-hmm. So there's a sense whereby something seemingly chaotic, yet there's form and structure there. And I would say it's the same too for the social world, that there's kind of human agency, which adds this element of unpredictability, but there's also structures working there. There's cultural forces at work, kind of constraining what happens, knowledge and understanding and perceptions of risks of flooding, or the fact that people want to preserve a golf course or protect a home. So there's this kind of interplay between kind of dynamism and structure that turns into a pattern that is the kind of thing that fascinates me and Richard, and that we're trying to make sense of, in a sense. Yeah. So I'd see it very similar to what you just described, Richard.
I wonder if there's similar tensions as well. I mean, between focusing on the particular and focusing on some kind of universal pattern or a simple pattern. So when you're listening to a piece of music, you're I think you generally get the most out of it if you're really trying to be aware to the detail and or at least not exclusive. You can't only focus on detail or underlying structure, but it seems to me that you often get the most out of it if you're really alive to the play of the detail, rather than trying to reduce it to sonata form or going, oh look, that's the entry of the fugue subject again. I mean, those things may come into play when you take a step back, but so there's that kind of tension when you're listening to music in these two forms, and also if you're, and I guess maybe this is more true for social scientists, so maybe for you, is there a tension between looking at a situation and trying to understand the human particulars and the human, all the different individual uh, concerns and desires, and then stepping back and looking at under some underlying structure, which which in a sense washes out the human detail. When you start looking at that statistical picture of things.
There is that.
But
that's when people say social science gets a bit too abstract.
Yeah, sure.
But I think, I think, I mean, so you take that one step further, and so you could say, well, who has a greater appreciation of the music in this case? Somebody who understands it with all its detail, or somebody who actually just likes it, right? With no understanding of the detail, I mean, the coastline, and everything else. I mean, Tim, it's the same, isn't it? Somebody who just sits on that beach and says, God, I just like this. I can't describe or define why. And actually, do they need to be able to understand and define why? It's just like that, rather than, I'm a scientist and I'll understand how every wave is an actor in here and moving X amount of sediment per volume of water and everything else. Does that make me appreciate it anymore? I don't know.
I think
that can be a pleasure in it for some of us, but I can agree. I think that we're all onto something here, which, I mean, I would say you could reflect on the idea of, I thought a lot about this composition in terms of it being something interdisciplinary that we tried to do together, and how the kind of science I do interacted with the music. But then I just listened to it as an individual and found it fun, and I didn't need to be a social scientist or even to think quite deeply about that to decide that I enjoyed it, and I found it quite moving and engaging and fun. Yeah.
Good. I mean, ultimately, that's sort of that's what appeals to me. I think if I'm creating something, isn't it? And I guess you're right. I mean, music is obviously all made up of patterns. A lot of them, they're not audible or you can't see them. And I guess I'm a lot of the program I'm using to put that together is a digital program, and I'm using these small increments of time to match things up and shifting things around with a mouse and all of that type of stuff, haven't I? So there's obviously inherently patterns which are maybe not audible, and I guess ultimately that's kind of maybe what you start to pick up on, maybe what Alex is alluding to there, in maybe more straightforward kind of repetitive patterns in music that are easy to understand. But that doesn't necessarily mean, as you said, Tim, whether anybody would enjoy it anymore, or whether you have to be aware of that, or where you have to think about it and recognize it. And actually it's still perfectly possible just to enjoy it, because maybe there is something quite innate about that sort of enjoyment and experience of it. I don't know. Yeah.